When I first bought the property by the lake, I thought I was buying peace. A quiet refuge where I could fish at sunrise, sip coffee on the porch while the mist lifted off the water, and finally enjoy the retirement I had earned after years of long hours and demanding projects. The lake itself wasn't large, about 40 acres in total, but it was fed by a steady spring and surrounded by a mix of old farmland and newer developments. My land, about 30 acres on the north side, was part wooded, part meadow, with direct access to the best stretch of shoreline. To me, it was perfect. I'd built a modest but sturdy cabin, timber frame, big windows facing the water, a wide deck where I could set my rocking chair. I wasn't looking for trouble. But trouble, as I would soon learn, had a name. And that name was Karen. Now, I didn't know it at the time. I'd heard about the Lake HOA from the realtor, but she brushed it off quickly. They mostly keep to themselves, she'd said. Some rules about docks, paint colors, and lawn care. But your parcel? It's outside their boundary. You don't have to worry about them. And she was right, at least legally. My property had been subdivided decades earlier, long before the HOA was formed, and the covenants that bound their members simply did not apply to me. I was what they called a non-member lot owner, independent, free. At first, I thought that meant I'd be left alone. But as anyone who has ever dealt with a certain type of HOA personality will tell you, some people cannot stand the idea of a neighbor who isn't under their control. That was Karen. She lived directly across the lake from me in one of those big faux colonial homes with perfectly trimmed hedges, a white vinyl fence, and a pontoon boat tied to a private dock. She was the self-appointed enforcer of the HOA, even though there was technically a board. Everyone in the neighborhood called her Madam President, half in jest, half in fear. The first time she appeared at my cabin, she didn't even knock. She marched right up my deck, clipboard in hand, and announced, "You need to sign these forms to join the association." I remember the way she said it. Not a request, not an invitation, a demand. I set down my coffee and looked her in the eye. "Ma'am, my property isn't part of your HOA. I made sure of that before I bought it." Her lips pursed. "Well, everyone who lives on this lake contributes. It's only fair. You use the roads, the lake, the amenities." I cut her off. "The roads, county maintained, the lake, part of my property line, amenities. I built my own dock, on my own land. I don't need your HOA. Her face went red. She sputtered something about community standards before storming off. I thought that would be the end of it. But if you've ever dealt with an HOA Karen, you know better. Over the next few weeks, the pressure campaign began. Letters in my mailbox, notes stuck to my truck windshield, phone calls at odd hours, and always the same refrain: join the HOA. I ignored them. Then came the threats, fines, lawsuits, liens, none of which they had the legal right to impose on me. I was independent. I'd checked the county records myself. My land predated their little fiefdom by a good 20 years, but Karen wasn't interested in law. She was interested in power. The day she finally called the cops was the day I realized just how far she was willing to go. The day started like any other. The lake was glassy, reflecting the pines in perfect symmetry. I had just finished tightening a few bolts on my dock when I noticed Karen across the lake. She was standing on her porch with her phone glued to her ear, glaring in my direction. At first, I didn't think much of it. She had been giving me dirty looks for weeks now. But there was something different this time. Something about the way she paced, stomping her heels on that perfect vinyl deck, one hand flailing as if to summon an invisible army. 2 hours later, I heard the crunch of tires on my gravel driveway. When I stepped out onto the porch, 2 sheriffs, deputies, were getting out of their cruiser. Their eyes swept the property, taking in the cabin, the dock, and then finally me. "Morning, sir," one of them said, adjusting his belt. "We got a call from the HOA president about a dispute. Said, You're refusing to comply with their rules. Behind them, huffing like a train engine, was Karen. Clipboard in one hand, phone still in the other, sunglasses perched like armor on her face. She looked at me with triumph, like she had just pulled the lever of justice and was about to wait. "Watch the gears crush me." I stayed calm. "Officers," I said, "thank you for coming. But you've been misinformed. My property is not under their HOA jurisdiction." Karen cut in before they could respond. "That's not true. He lives on the lake. He uses the lake. He's part of the community, which means he's part of the HOA. He owes dues, and he's in violation of multiple standards." The deputy raised a hand to quiet her. "Ma'am, let him speak." I handed him a folder I had prepared weeks earlier, almost as if I had known this day would come. Inside were copies of my deed, the subdivision map from the county clerk's office, and a letter from my real estate attorney verifying that my parcel was excluded from the HOA covenants. "Everything is recorded in the county office," I said. "This property was subdivided decades before the HOA even existed. They have no authority here." The deputy flipped through the documents, then looked at his partner. They both nodded slightly. Karen's face tightened. But that can't be right. Everyone on this lake has to be part of it. That's how it's always been." "Not him," the deputy said, handing back my folder. "Ma'am, you can't enforce HOA rules on a property that's not in your association. That's a civil matter, and from the looks of it, he's in the clear." The silence that followed was thick. For the first time, I saw Karen falter. Her face went pale, then flushed crimson. "He's freeloading," she snapped, her voice rising. "He's using our lake, our roads, our community." "Ma'am," the deputy said firmly, "the lake is shared water access and the roads are county-maintained. This gentleman has rights to use both. If you continue harassing him, you could be the one facing charges." That stopped her cold. For a moment, she stood frozen on my driveway, clipboard trembling in her hands, her mouth opening and closing, like a fish pulled out of water. She wasn't used to being told she was wrong, especially not in front of her supposed enemy. Then she turned on her heel and stormed off toward her car, muttering something about taking this to the board. The deputies gave me a polite nod, wished me a good day, and left. When their cruiser disappeared down the lane, I leaned back against the porch rail and exhaled. I thought that would be the end of it. But people like Karen don't accept defeat. They don't process it like normal folks. To them, no is just the beginning of war, and I had just won the first battle. After the deputies left that day, I naively thought Karen might cool off. Maybe she'd lick her wounds, retreat to her big vinyl-fenced palace, and leave me alone. That's what a reasonable person would do. But Karen wasn't reasonable. Within a week, she had the HOA board on her side. Flyers appeared on mailboxes around the southern half of the lake, with my name plastered across them. "Non-compliant property owner threatens our community," the headline read, followed by a litany of accusations. She said I was polluting the water. She said I was trespassing on HOA-owned amenities. She even accused me of hosting illegal gatherings at my cabin, which was funny, because I hadn't invited a single soul over since moving in. It was pure fiction, but in HOA land, fiction spreads faster than truth. Suddenly, neighbors who had once waved politely when passing in their pontoon boats now turned their eyes away. Some even shouted insults across the water. Karen had turned me into the villain of her story. But what she didn't realize was that I was playing a longer game. You see, before buying my lakefront cabin, I had invested heavily in land throughout the county. Quiet purchases made through an LLC handled by a property trust. I never bragged about it, never flaunted it. That wasn't my style. But the truth was, I owned several parcels that people didn't even realize were mine. One of them happened to be the lot Karen's home sat on. It wasn't obvious, of course. She thought she owned her house outright. But years earlier, when the developer who built her subdivision went bankrupt, some of the land transactions had been messy. The homes were sold quickly, deeds shuffled, paperwork signed in haste. Most homeowners ended up with what are called ground leases, owning the house but not the dirt beneath it. The land was leased from the original trust for 99 years. Guess who bought that trust? That's right, me. So while Karen strutted around like Queen of the Lake, threatening me with fines and police, she was cutting rent checks, indirectly. To me, she had no idea, and I wasn't the kind of man to flex that power carelessly. I had lived peacefully for months, content to let her carry on with her little empire. But when she turned the community against me, when she tried to weaponize the law and destroy my reputation, I realized the time was coming when I would have to remind her just who held the deed under her throne. It wasn't about revenge. Not yet. It was about balance. The more she raged, the more I prepared. I gathered documents. I reviewed the lease agreements. I met with my attorney, who grinned when I laid out the situation. You know, he said, flipping through the contracts, technically, if she violates certain conditions, harassment of neighbors, unlawful activity, creating nuisance, you'd be well within your rights to terminate her lease. She'd own the house, sure, but without the land she's squatting. That thought simmered in my mind like a storm cloud forming over still water. Meanwhile, Karen ramped up. She started hosting HOA meetings specifically about me. Neighbors told me she stood at the front of the clubhouse, voice shaking with fury, declaring that this outsider must be dealt with. She talked about lawsuits, special assessments, even hiring private security to monitor my cabin. I stayed quiet, calm, patient, because I knew the day was coming when the balance of power would flip. And when it did, Karen's clipboard, her sunglasses, her smug little empire, all of it would shatter. The night of the HOA board meeting was humid, the kind of summer evening where the air itself feels heavy with anticipation. Word had spread fast that the meeting's only agenda item was me. I hadn't been invited, of course, but I showed up. Anyway, the clubhouse was packed when I walked in. Folding chairs lined the walls, neighbors fanning themselves with printouts of Karen's latest flyers. At the front stood Karen, dressed in a stiff navy blazer as if she were running for office, her ever-present clipboard in hand. She beamed when she saw me enter, not with kindness, but with the smug confidence of a prosecutor watching a guilty man walk into court. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said loudly so everyone could hear, "the non-compliant property owner has decided to join us tonight. Perhaps he's ready to admit his violations and pay his dues." A murmur rippled through the room. Some smirked. Others looked uncomfortable. I didn't take a seat. Instead, I walked straight to the front and set a thick folder on the table. "Actually," I said calmly, "I'm here to clarify a few things." Karen rolled her eyes. "We've heard your excuses before. This community has rules, and you've ignored every one of them. You've disrespected your neighbors, refused to contribute, and endangered the harmony of Lakeview." I opened the folder, sliding out the first set of documents. "What you call excuses," I said. "The county calls facts." I held up the subdivision map, clearly marked with the date. "My property was recorded in 1978. Your HOA was formed in 1995. My parcel was never annexed. Your covenants stop at my fence line. You cannot fine me. You cannot lien me. You cannot police me." The deputies who had come weeks earlier had already told her as much, but hearing it in front of the entire community hit harder. There were nods from the crowd, a few whispers. Karen's face reddened. She stepped forward, jabbing a finger at me. "He's twisting the law. He may have found a loophole, but he still lives here. He still uses our lake, our roads, our amenities. He's a parasite." That was when I laid down the second set of documents, leases, titles, the trust agreements. "Karen," I said, my voice low but steady, "you've spent weeks harassing me, slandering me, calling the police on me. You've told everyone here I don't belong. But here's the truth. The land your home sits on, the dirt beneath your vinyl fence and your big fancy porch, it belongs to me." For a moment, the room was silent, the kind of silence that vibrates in your bones. Karen blinked. What are you talking about? I slid the papers toward her. Your house. Sure, you own it. But the ground, that's a 99-year lease. The trust that owns it? I bought it. Which makes me... I paused, letting the weight of it hang. Your landlord. The color drained from her face. The clipboard slipped from her fingers and clattered to the floor. Gasps filled the room. Some neighbors leaned forward to read the documents. Others stared at her in shock. One man in the back let out a low whistle. Karen stumbled, her voice breaking. That's impossible. I would have known. You didn't, I said, because you never bothered to look past your own power trip. You thought you owned this lake. You thought you controlled me. But the truth is, while you were trying to evict me from a community I was never part of, I could evict you from your own home. Her knees buckled slightly, and for the first time since I'd met her, Karen looked small. The board members shifted uncomfortably. One cleared his throat. Is this true? He asked, eyes flicking between me and the papers. It's true, I said. Filed with the county, verified by my attorney. If you'd like, I'll be happy to share copies with anyone who doubts it. The room erupted. Neighbors who had once sneered at me now whispered in awe. Some looked angry, not at me, but at Karen, for dragging them into a crusade built on lies. Karen, meanwhile, just stood there, pale and shaking. Her empire had crumbled in less than 5 minutes. I picked up my folder, tucked the documents back inside, and turned to the crowd. I didn't move here to fight. I moved here for peace. I don't want your dues, your meetings, or your rules. I just want to enjoy the lake in peace. But if anyone here still believes Karen's story, let me be clear. She doesn't own me. She never did. And now you know why. I left the clubhouse to the sound of voices rising behind me. Confusion, anger, disbelief. The queen had fallen, and her kingdom would never be the same again.